Okay, we're just about all back in, I think, and appreciate your perseverance, I guess would be a word I'd use. This is a session on Satan's strategies, and particularly we'll kind of focus this week on society, next week on the church, but as I said yesterday, there is a natural overlap, unfortunately, because what affects society tends to affect the church at some point. Maybe there's about a decade delay, and I'm not even sure that is true. But just as a way of a little bit of review for those of us that were here, and insight for those who maybe weren't able to be with us, we were talking yesterday about the importance of worldviews. And this little graphic, I think, kind of drives home, maybe in a much briefer way, what I was trying to say as we were concluding yesterday. All of us have a worldview. It's how we view the world. It's our beliefs, it's our assumptions, and to some extent it's our knowledge. We get it through our education, we get it through our environment, we get it through all of the things that affect us. But that worldview is crucial, because that determines what we consider our values to be. And of course that is crucial because that determines what our choices are that we make. All of us in a behavioral sense have made choices that weren't necessarily the most pleasing to us, but they were choices that we made because of our worldview, especially if you have a biblical worldview. For instance, and I don't want to show of hands, but I'm going to make a rather safe assumption that most of the married people here this morning have not committed adultery. Now, I don't know that for a fact, but I would hope that that's the case of majority. If you have, of course, forgiveness is possible. But my question is, if you're a married person and have never committed adultery, why? Is it because you never saw another person that was as or more attractive than your mate? Now be careful. I would venture that for us that are married and have not committed adultery, it is because of our worldview. It is because of our dedication to our mate. It's because of our view of what the Bible teaches about marriage. We've had some comments on that. And I think that's absolutely right. And it's our guiding principles. You ladies, probably most of you, and I don't know that this is true of all of you, and of course this is not a condemnation because there's always forgiveness, most of you ladies have probably never had an abortion. Why? Is it because you never had an unexpected pregnancy? This auditorium is full of whoopses. That's just a fact. It doesn't mean we aren't loved, it just means we're whoops. But those of you ladies who never have had an abortion, why? It's because of your worldview, probably, in most cases. Those are just, and I really didn't mean that to be humorous, so I guess maybe it can be, but that's the import of our worldview. And that's what I'm trying to address, at least in the first few sessions, how important I think that is as Satan's strategy. If I can change your worldview, adultery would not be an issue for you. If I can change your worldview from a biblical worldview to some of the other worldviews we're going to be talking about, abortion would not be an issue for you. In fact, it might be the logical choice. It's not the morally right choice, but it can be the logical choice. I will have you raise your hands on this one. How many of you have ever tried to make a living selling something? How many of you enjoyed that? Okay. I've done it, and I did enjoy it on occasion. Question. What is the easiest thing to sell? Sounds rather simple, but it's selling something that somebody wants to buy. I can sell real well if somebody wants to buy it. That's easy. Even the most introverted, insecure person here could sell if they found someone who wanted to buy. Well, I think Satan's worldview strategy is exactly what man wants to buy and believe. It's an easy sell. He is not dumb. He is selling what he knows most men and women want to buy. As we go through some of these. And so he has an easy sell. He has a very easy sell. And that's why most people buy it. Not because it's logical. Not because it's better. But because it's what they want to buy. Or what they want to believe, if you will. Kind of as a few thoughts that came to me as I was listening to the classes in the last day and a half, and I'm sure John will have comments on this as he gets to chapter 4, but it does bear on what we're talking about here, so I don't think it will hurt to touch on it. One of the classic passages on Satan's strategy is 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 1. Now the Spirit speaketh expressly that in the latter time some shall depart from the faith, giving heed to seducing spirits and doctrines of devils. I believe all false teaching comes from hell or from the devil. I don't believe he can make us do it, but he finds a willing buyer, and then we take it and we run with it. I'm also intrigued with that concept of seducing spirits, because we all can be seduced, and many people have been seduced. Another thought that I was thinking about, as those of you, before I get to that, John made the comment this morning about, I think it was the false teachers, and they'll use religious terms and they'll mean something different. I think that's also true in the moral aspect. Have you noticed how homosexuality is no longer a moral issue, it's a discrimination issue? That's clever. It's wrong, but it's clever. Because who wants to be accused of being discriminating against the minority? Well, homosexuality is a moral issue. Those of us with the biblical worldview. But it is not being presented that way. Court case after court case says, and I'll paraphrase, but you can almost finish this, we do not have the right to discriminate against. Well, I think the Lord has given the right to, I don't know if discriminate is the right word, but certainly to distinguish from the immoral activity, be it whatever. I just chose homosexuality because that's our hot issue right now. 15 years ago it would have been abortion. A few years ago it would have been capital punishment. And that's what occurs. Another thing, as I was ruminating and listening, Charles, if you were with Charles in his class 2 days before tomorrow, he referenced in Acts chapter 17 Paul's visit into Athens, and he made a comment about Paul, and he said, there's an example of a man who changed his worldview. Absolutely right. But I'm intrigued with maybe how that stuck with Paul in a unique way. In Acts chapter 17, where is Paul? Anybody just remember? He's in Athens, and we have what we call the Mars Hill encounter. And he goes there, and I'm going to turn there and just notice a few things that I think is maybe a lesson for me, and you can apply it to yourself as you seem appropriate. In Acts chapter 17, verse 22, then Paul stood in the midst of Mars Hill, and he said, you men of Athens, I perceive that in all things you are too superstitious or religious, depending on your translation. What's Paul saying there? He's saying, men of Athens, I perceive what your worldview is. And of course, he sees a worldview of idolatry, and he goes into his speech. Now, I imagine there were lots of sins in Athens that Paul could have jumped all over. And there are times when he did that, Corinth. But I notice here, or at least if I read this passage right, number one, he perceives or he observes what their worldview is. He examines what their worldview is. And then he tries to correct their worldview by sharing his worldview. And he goes into this discussion about how the Lord, and it's kind of a little synopsis of the Old Testament. He even gets down in verse 31 and talks about the judgment day, when Christ is going to judge us. What is Paul doing? He's observing or noticing their worldview, and then trying to change their worldview by sharing his worldview. I think Paul understood, I'm not going to correct these people in their sin until I change or get them to change their worldview. You know, I think there's a wonderful evangelistic insight for you and I. You know, we're often trepidatious about sharing the gospel. And I don't know if you've ever tried this, but have you ever asked somebody what their worldview was? It does a couple of things. Maybe it gets them thinking, but it gets them talking, and everybody's interested when they're talking. But then it gives you an opportunity to share your worldview with them. We don't have to say, well, you're doing this, so you better quit it, or you're going to hell. Now, there's times when that bluntness is appropriate. But to get people thinking, if you really want to change a person's life, we've got to change their worldview. Abortion, homosexuality, euthanasia, on and on, adultery, fornication, don't make any sense. I mean, the prohibition of those things don't make any sense to people that don't have a biblical worldview. We're talking to the wind a little bit. And they didn't mean that. They didn't take that. They didn't mean anything to us. Some of you were raised with a different worldview. And hasn't your life changed once your worldview changed? Of course it has. That is absolutely essential. Okay, I don't know if I've got anything else on this slide or not. Well, that's just the case of my verbiage getting ahead of my slide. When I put WV up there for the rest of my classes, that's worldview. I think that's kind of obvious. I just get tired of it. My fingers hurt. Just a little bit of review. A worldview is the grid through which one sees and interprets all aspects of life. And therefore, it's how we make our decisions. It defines ourselves. It defines how we view others. It defines our relationships. And once Satan is able to contaminate a worldview, replace a biblical worldview with a non-biblical worldview, all these other issues just fall into his domain. I have no logical argument against any sin if we don't hold the biblical worldview. Now, I can point out bad things that happen because of them, but I can also point out logic that entails them. Okay, we'll move on here a little bit. One of the issues of worldview has to do with perspective. So this little cartoon, and it's not, Tom's not here. It's not a cartoon of a biblical character. But these fish, look at that fish, it says that's the largest fish in the world. Well, to them it is, because their world is so myopic. When you have a biblical worldview, you look at things in a much broader context, don't you? And Charles alluded to this, talking about Cariella. Because of our biblical worldview, we view that differently than if we didn't have a biblical worldview. Okay? And that's true of almost all events that happen to us. We've talked about culture and society, so I thought maybe I ought to try to define those two, and I don't find them as easy to define or to differentiate as I might like, but that won't keep me from trying. Culture is the ideas, skills, and arts, etc., of a group of people at a particular time. So we in America have a culture. Society, however, tends to be the people. We are a society that has a culture. Society is a group of people forming a single community or economic class, and that could be a geographical community, it could be an ideological community, it could be a physical relationship community, however you want to structure it. Societies have cultures. I tend to look at societies having cultures more than I look at cultures having societies, but I don't want to get into semantic debate. Therefore, Satan's attack on our culture and society is an attempt to redefine our norms. What is right and wrong. And that's why our worldview as a society and as a culture, I believe, is so absolutely essential. And Satan knows that. Worldviews differ with different areas of the globe. People in India have a different worldview because they have a different culture. And they have to work through that. The Muslim countries have a different worldview. And it's hard for us to sometimes grasp what drives them. And I suspect it's hard for them to sometimes grasp what drives us. And I'll admit it's hard for me to grasp sometimes what drives us. I don't even always understand what drives me. And I suspect I'm not alone. When we consider a worldview, people are usually really trying to answer a series of questions. And I wanted to just touch on these before I go into some of the worldviews, as I said we would do yesterday. Serious contemplation, of a worldview asks the question, is there a God? Because really everything starts with the answer to that. I believe, and we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail, I believe life has meaning for two reasons. Number one, there is a God, and number two, there is immortality. Were it not for those two things, my life would have no meaning, and neither would yours. I might convince myself it does. And I don't believe just simply believing in God is enough. I think you also have to believe in immortality, but I'll hold that thought for a little bit later. Secondly, what is the nature of man? The biblical worldview says we are created in the image of God. But if you don't believe in God, then that's a pretty meaningless statement, isn't it? Or an empty statement. Are we an animal? Yes. Are we just an animal? That's the question. Most people make their choices and decisions, I believe, under the worldview that we are basically just the highest element of the animal chain. And if that is one's worldview, it is going to change your choices and your decisions. What is the basis for our ethics and morality? Well, probably Thursday I'll spend probably the entire hour on the problem of evil and pain. And that essential question brings into forebearing what is the basis of our morality and our ethics. Is there such a thing as truth? Remember Pilate kind of asked that question. I would have loved to have heard him say that, because the way he voiced that could have changed the meaning of his question almost 180 degrees. I don't know if it was a serious question or a mocking question, but it is a question. And many people struggle with this. I think we struggle with this sometimes. I think thinking people struggle with it. Why is there evil and suffering? Well, this is the problem of pain and evil that I alluded to. So I'm not going to try to answer that today, but the classic question is, if your God is all-loving and all-powerful, how can He allow evil, pain, and suffering to exist? Probably for me, that's the strongest argument the atheists have. I don't buy it. I just think it's probably their strongest argument. What happens when we die? How you answer that question is going to determine how you make your decisions and choices. Does everybody go to heaven? Do some of us go to heaven and the rest of us just quit existing? Annihilation? Is there a hell? That's an issue. These are the questions that I think guide our lives in the most serious areas of our lives. These don't tell us what car to buy. These don't tell us what house to live in. These don't tell us what foods we like the best. But these are the questions that are going to determine what are the serious issues of life, I believe, for each of us. I've inserted this because I found a quote that I really liked, and before I give it to you, this quote takes poetic license, I will readily admit. But you remember the occurrence in John chapter 2, Jesus' miracle of turning the water into wine? I just love what Alexander Cole, a poet, said about this. He said, "The conscience water saw the master and it blushed." This image of water turning, I guess, to red wine in his view. Well, obviously water isn't conscious. It doesn't blush. But I just thought that was a wonderful thought for this reason. In the presence of the master, the water could not remain unchanged. So it turned to wine. Until we consciously see the master and blush, we're not going to come to grips with our purpose or our design. Hence, most people live and die never understanding why they've been here or why they were placed here, in my opinion. Because their worldview doesn't account for that. Satan wants to change our worldviews so that we won't see the master. He wants to sell us, and I'm saying us as a society, a worldview that discounts the master. That's why Darwinianism is so appealing. It's not because of its logic. It's not because of its scientific validity. It's because it removes God from the process of creation. That was an insert, I will admit that. But I liked it. Now I'm going to spend time on four or five major worldviews. These are not necessarily new to you. Some of you, they may be new to you. Terminology changes a little bit. But we're going to be using these terms and these concepts throughout probably the remainder of this my time in the 2 weeks. So I want to make sure that we're all thinking about them in a similar way. It used to be that most people in America believed that there was a God, and the Bible was His Word. I'm not going to claim that most people lived as if they believed it, but I think that was probably a leading thought. They believed in heaven and hell, or at least something close to it. The hurdles to spreading the gospel were apathy, lack of response, wrong views of how to get to heaven, but I think that's largely changed in our culture. Now many people simply don't believe in God. People used to say they believed and acted as if they didn't, maybe. Now I think it's very likely that most people have convinced themselves that He does not exist. And they certainly don't believe that the Bible is the Word of God. Thomas Jefferson took his Bible and cut out 84 verses because he wanted the Thomas Jefferson Bible. Well, are there verses I would like to cut out? Well, I've got to be very careful how I answer that. My humanness would like to take some of those things out, but my appreciation for God knows that that would be totally suicidal. So we live by them. That's our worldview. The first worldview that I'll touch on is simply called theism, and it is a belief that there is a God. Now, theism and Christianity are not synonymous. I believe there are a lot of theists who aren't Christians. Or at least they feel they believe in a God, but they don't conduct themselves in a way that I understand the gospel to ask them to conduct themselves. Most people say they are theists. They may not use that word, but you've seen the surveys. We believe there is a God. 80% of America believes there's a God, and 10% of America goes to church. You know, that's a great disconnect. And maybe those aren't the numbers your survey says. But theism is a belief that there is a God beyond time and space who created the universe out of nothing and is involved in events, supernatural. He reveals himself to man through nature and through the Bible, or for the Jews through the Old Testament, or maybe to the Muslims through the Quran. He sets the rules for man, and there will be consequences for not adhering to the rules that God has given us. That is probably a description of most of our mindsets. Now, deism is a form of theism, but it believes God did create the world, but then he kind of wound the clock up and now he just lets it run and he stands off. But anyway, I would still put it under the theistic umbrella. Another one that I would comment on is called pantheism. And it seems like somebody mentioned this word in one of the classes. I'm just not quick enough on my recall to remember who did. And if nobody did, then never mind. But this is a form, a worldview that God is in everything. It teaches that everything is God. Humans have God in them. Animals, plants, they're all God. Everything is God. The world is God and God is the world. God is therefore not personal. He is not a he is an it. The universe is one. And knowledge is getting in touch with cosmic consciousness, which is a little Gnostic, although I wouldn't necessarily say that the Gnostics were pantheistic all the way through. They view history as cyclic, and men, some of them, are reincarnated. It's the basis for some of the great world religions, Hinduism, Buddhism, Christian Science, and here New Age teaching. God is in everything. Let me ask you, was pantheism ever true? Yeah, I think pantheism was true. I don't think it's true now. But if pantheism is God is in everything, before the creation, God was all there was, so I guess he was in everything. But since the creation, pantheism is not true, because God is not in everything. God is everywhere, but not everything is not God. Thirdly, naturalism, and I put in parentheses modernism. There are some shades of differences in these, but they're very, very similar. Naturalism takes the position that God probably doesn't exist, but even if he does, he's not the source of our answers. Naturalism or modernism looks for man's reasoning for the source of answers. It is, to a large extent, a basis for not only evolution, but for a lot of psychology that we have today. Look within yourself for the answer. Well, there's times we need to look within ourselves. Paul says, examine yourselves, whether you be in the faith. But there's lots of times when he says, look up for the answer. And that is one of the great differences. It believes that we live in a closed system which God is not operating, and the world and mankind just evolved. And people are the product of their environment, and morality is decided by man. We decide what is right or wrong. History just happens. When you die, you cease to exist. You know, there's several ironies about this. Charles was, in his class this morning, commented on why they only did 39 versus 40, because they didn't want to deface man. As he said that, I agreed with him, but I thought the great irony today, what our society wants to do is to debase man so that we can do what we want to do. That's why we want to simply be animals. Now, we don't want to be called animals. We don't really want to think of ourselves as just animals. But if we can convince ourselves that we are governed by the laws of animals, then think of all of the things that become fair game. Before I go to this one, the other thought I had, you remember one of the arguments against capital punishment is it is dehumanizes, I'll give it, the individual. Well, it's a terrible thing to have to do. But I believe it's a biblical concept that hasn't been rescinded. Pluralism or postmodernism, as I put in parentheses, pluralism simply just kind of is a cafeteria style of a worldview. Everything's right, nothing's wrong. I was reading the other day, and I thought this was kind of an interesting way. You usually think of an answer as either right or wrong, but answers can be three different things. They can be right or wrong or not even wrong. Obviously, we know what a right answer means. We know what is wrong, but some answers are so nonsensical you can't tell if they're right or wrong. And I think we're going to be dealing with some of those. Pluralism, modernism, postmodernism, rejects the idea that man can figure out what's right because there is no right and wrong. Everything's right, and there is no wrong. They seek spirituality, not religion. I was talking to a lady about a month ago, and she wanted to emphasize to me that she was very spiritual, but she wasn't religious. She was very spiritual, but she doesn't go to church. And it wasn't the right time. It was at a kind of a somber moment. But I simply said, well, I hope you find a place you can believe in. But so much of our culture considers themselves spiritual, but not accountable. Pluralism really violates the law of non-contradiction. The law of non-contradiction in philosophy and logic simply says two opposing views can't both be right. And that is so logical. Now, two opposing views can both be wrong, but they can't both be right. Pluralism says two opposing views can be right, and therefore that leads us to a lot of things like ecumenicalism and so forth in the religious world. Before I go to the last one, I had another comment on pantheism. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in a few days, but pantheism has a real inherent problem. If everything is God and evil exists, then God has to be evil. And that's a non-starter from a logical standpoint. If everything is God, which pantheism teaches, and evil exists, then God has to, in some ways, be evil. Because pantheism causes the creator and the creation to be one. And that is a tremendously theological non-starter. But we'll talk a little bit more about that probably a little bit later. The one that probably we will talk a little bit more about is atheism. I don't find a lot of people that call themselves atheists. But I see a lot of people that, in my humble opinion, live as if they are. So it must be, in some way, somewhat their underlying view. Richard Dawkins, a noted, not a great, but a noted atheist, author of the book, The God Delusion, says, "We are all atheists about most of the gods that humanity has ever believed in. Some of us just go one God further." Well, he's kind of right. I'm an atheist about Baal, because I don't believe in Baal. But what he's trying to say is, I think atheists aren't really much different than us. They just go one God further. Well, that one God further is a quantum leap, isn't it? So please don't put me in that category. Christopher Hitchens, and I think he died in the last year or two, author of God Is Not So Great, stated, "That which can be asserted without evidence," he's implying Christianity is asserted without evidence, "can be dismissed without evidence." Well, yeah, you can dismiss it, but that doesn't make it go away, does it? But that was his worldview. That's the worldview of these men. But is it true that there is no evidence for God? Now, I know I'm preaching to the choir a little bit, but you're going to have to, with me, go out and preach to the non-choir. So let's hone our thoughts maybe just a little bit. Paul states in Romans chapter 1, verses 18 through 22, that nature is evidence of God. I don't think nature tells me how to be saved, but it tells me there has to be a God. Because atheism says nothing was affected by nothing in this nothingness, and we get something. Now, I'm not trying to be flippant, but that's about the logic of it. The verses in Romans 1 say that God is known by all, or at least certain aspects of God are based upon the evidence of His universe. Specifically, His eternal power, The story is told of Napoleon, and I can't prove this, but it's a nice story. He was sailing with his army, or his soldiers, and he heard them talking about a mocking God. And his soldiers were mocking God in his existence. And Napoleon is reported to have simply pointed up to the stars that night and said, "Gentlemen, you'll first have to get rid of these." Which was a way of saying God is in nature. So, why do people yet reject the existence of God? Well, I think there are several reasons, but let me give you three. Rejection of God is primarily a moral. Let me make sure I'm not way ahead of myself here. No, I'm not. Rejection of God is primarily a moral problem, and intellectual problems don't solve moral problems. Remember yesterday I said I don't think legislation is going to change morality. I've never seen it happen. I wish if it did, I'd try harder at it. Let me put it that way. I started to say I wish it would, but that would depend upon who's in charge of the legislation. But rejection of God is a moral issue, not an intellectual issue. It's trying to be made an intellectual issue. Only the foolish believe in God. That's the intellectual argument. But it is not an intellectual argument. It is a moral argument. In addition to that, one refuses to be morally accountable because one doesn't want to be morally accountable. So the rejection of God, in a way, is that old debate of presuppositional apologetics versus evidential apologetics. The Bible presupposes that God exists. Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created. It just starts with the assumption that God exists because that's the only logical assumption for any thinking person to realize. Now, I know I can sound harsh by saying everyone that doesn't believe in God isn't a thinking person. I don't believe that, but if we don't believe in God, we're not a right-thinking person. I think I could state that. And there are ways to address that. Let me comment a little bit on some of the impacts that atheism has on our morality and on our culture. An atheist would view this as a positive thing. Their view removes religious baggage. We're free. We can do whatever we want. Well, of course we are free. Those of you that are church leaders or those of you that have counseled people in the church, you ever had somebody say, "Do I have to come? You mean I have to come on Sunday night? Do I have to come on Wednesday night?" I remember the first time I was asked that, and I was in the pulpit. I guess it was I probably opened it up for discussion and shouldn't. My answer is no, you don't have to come, because we all have choice. It's whether or not you want to do what the Lord wants you to do. That's the issue. Nobody has to do anything because God gave us free will. I did not look this up on the map. I'm going to ask Dwayne. Have you ever heard of Liberal, Missouri? Has anybody heard of Liberal, Missouri? Okay, it exists. There is a town. Well, some of you may know what I'm going to say. It was a fascinating town. It was established by a man by the name of George Walser in 1880. Now, what I'm going to describe to you in 1880 is not Liberal, Missouri today. But he founded it as a town for infidels. And its claim to fame is there is no church and there is no discussion of God or hell in Liberal, Missouri. And he wanted to prove that a society or a community could prosper without having to believe in God. Well, you'll be glad to hear that it was an absolute disaster. A few years after Liberal, Missouri was established, a reporter from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch went down there and wrote a story about it. And without reading to you the story, he basically said Liberal, Missouri is a disaster. To the point that the city of Liberal, Missouri sued the St. Louis Post-Dispatch for slander. But it never came to court because it was so obvious the story was true. But when you think about it, how can a community exist if they don't believe in moral laws and moral concepts? Well, that's kind of a trepidatious thing for me to think about, because a lot of our communities are getting very, very close to that. Well, liberal Missouri is not like that now. I've not been to liberal Missouri. I have a little desire to go there, so someday. What it showed, and others have showed, there are consequences. Atheism Impact on Morality teaches that there's simply no God worth having that exists. No life after death exists. There's no foundation for ethics. And therefore there's no meaning to life. And human free will really doesn't exist because there's really no choices between right and wrong to be made. It's just do whatever we want to do. Now, I know we all agree on those points. But here's a quote from an individual that you're familiar with. This person said, if a person doesn't think there is a God to be accountable to, then what's the point of trying to modify your behavior to keep it in acceptable ranges? Well, the answer to that is there is none. And he says, that's how I thought anyway. Anybody remember who said that? Now, we've heard about his conversion, and I'm not judging that one way or the other, but that's the mindset that just Katie barred the door. Katie barred the door. The aspect it has on the sanctity of life. I may show it to you before I'm done. I probably should have inserted this, but I had a little caricature, and it's this little baby laying in a blanket. It's obviously just been born. And it has the little baby saying, "Whew, I made it." And that's kind of sad, but kind of revealing too, isn't it? The aspect that this mindset has on the sanctity of life is, if we compare a severely defective human infant with a non-human animal, a dog or a pig, for example, we will often find that the non-human has superior capacity. Is that ever true? Well, in very tragic senses, I guess that could possibly be true in some areas of capacity. He goes on to say the only fact that a defective infant is a member, only the fact that a defective infant is a member of the species Homo sapiens leads it to be treated differently. But species membership alone, however, is not morally relevant. That is the mindset that you've almost forced to take. This was a guy by the name of Peter Singer. It appeared in Sanctity of Life, 1981 edition. But remember I talked about how this debases humans. It makes us animals. We don't like to think of animals, but we like to be, shall we say, freed as animals. I forget the man who wrote it. It was a UCLA sociologist. He called us urbanized cavemen. I've always thought that was a sad but accurate approach. Which now leads us to some aspect of atheistic ethics. It's called the way that you weigh up suffering. An example of that. If the fetus suffers less than mom, eliminate it. Because ending suffering is a moral act. And you can see the application of that to euthanasia. Ending suffering is a moral act. Now, there are times when you might be able to say ending suffering is a merciful act, but ending life, as this is taken, is not such. Another aspect of atheistic ethics is if animals do it, so can we, because that's all we are. I would probably say there are many animal species that are more monogamous than the human species. But that's not the total argument. An atheist can say they don't like it, but a true atheist can never say that it's immoral, because they have no basis of morality to base immorality on. And we'll get into more of that when we talk about pain and suffering. When you ask an atheist, a true atheist, why don't you do that? They'll say, well, I don't like it. But if they ever say because it's immoral, you've got it. Because that's an illogical statement. The next question is, well, where is morality determined? Well, if there is no God and no moral lawgiver, there's no morality. Another quote. I would love to see all of you, and I had to exit that, die. MBK. I love it. Sometime in April, me and V will get vengeance and we'll kick natural selection up a few notches. I don't know if that rings a bell. It's been a few years. And if I told you the name of the man that quoted that was Eric Harris. That may or may not ring a bell. Eric Harris was one of the Columbine shooters. I don't know if he was mentally balanced or not. I'm not qualified to say that. I'm simply saying that is where the removal of God from our society leaves us. It's where the removal of moral law leaves us. I'm not going to take the time because time's running out on me, but Leviticus 18 and there's lots of passages that talk about God's laws and how we're to treat one another and how we're to deal with one another. I've got 1 minute, so I'm not going to go any further than that. Because I wish I could put that up there with how you see in the picture first. I want to talk about this picture. It's lunchtime. This is one of the jewels of God's family. One of the absolute jewels. And one of my greatest privileges over the last few years is when I would be up here, Audrey would have me out to her double wide, and some lady would always bring her coffee. Well, you see this big plate? There was only 2 of us going to eat. And I think this picture maybe was 2 years ago, maybe 1 year. Audrey couldn't do this quite now, I don't think, although Sunday she looked pretty spry to me. But if she could have us all out to her house for lunch, she would. She would. Just a dear, sweet lady. I've lost track of all of the people that have said, and we're not the judge, I understand that. If Audrey doesn't make it, none of us are going to make it. Well, I don't know that I can make that as a definitive statement, but it sure feels about right to me. Just a special lady. So I'm going to have pictures of various people, and I want you to know I have gotten permission. So this is a complimentary picture. A couple of them will be less complimentary. But I'll try to do that all before the second Friday, so that if I need to come forward, I can do that. But, and Mark can shut it off. One of them I have permission of their parents, so if there's an issue there, they can go see Mom and Dad. But anyway, that was just too priceless to not share with you. Are there any announcements? Lowell says, I think the kitchen downstairs is tapped out, so don't go down there. I mean, if you brought food, go down there, but there's not any free food. Is that the right way to say it? Like yesterday, there was some taco stuff left over. Are there any announcements or things we need to say before we break for lunch? Okay, well, thank you very, very much for your attention. I'm going to ask Junior Buchanan, if he would, come up to the mic and have a prayer for our lunch and for our efforts today. Junior, as we stand.
God and Father in heaven, we're thankful